Welcome to the FML podcast, the podcast on a mission to uncover actionable insights, explore the latest trends, and to catalyze your fintech's growth. Join Growth Gorilla's founder and managing director, Shameer Sachdev, and some of fintech's hardest-hitting marketers and leaders.
Welcome everyone to today's episode of the FML podcast. Today we're joined by two guests, Chris and Huw, co-founders and CEO and CCO of Ozone API. Gents, thank you very, very much for coming on today. I think the best place to start is just doing a little intro and telling us a little bit about yourselves. I would say, Chris, do you want to lead the way?
Thanks, Shameer. My name's Chris Michael, the CEO of Ozone. I've got about 30 plus years background in tech, sort of building and leading tech companies and teams. In the noughties, I ended up being an owner manager of a couple of digital agencies and got really interested in this concept of what you can do with data. So our kind of strength and what we did as a business was using data to drive smarter marketing, things like conversion rate optimization, etc. Not in financial services. My background isn't financial services, but many of our customers were financial service customers. It was actually quite frustrating because we had lots of great ideas about what we could do with data and couldn't do it because we couldn't get access to our customers, the large global companies we were working for. We couldn't get access to their data. I spent a bit of time, I kind of left the agency world, spent a bit of time in government on some of their digital transformation programs. And then I set up an internal digital practice inside a company called Reckitt, a large consumer packaged goods company. The cool thing we did there is built a predictive modeling engine which could predict sales at a very granular level. And that was all based on APIs and the power of APIs, because we were accessing data from lots of different sources, blending it together, doing really smart stuff with data. And you know, the power of merging data together and what you can do with it is pretty cool. And that's why I got interested in this whole kind of open banking space. Back in 2016, 2017, was approached by the OBIE in the UK to come and lead their development of the open banking standard. And that's kind of where I got into financial services, really. And that's where I sort of started out. And that's where the seeds of Ozone came from when Huw and I and Freddie, our other co-founder, met we were all working together at the OBIE.
Cool. That's amazing, Chris. I'll say, Huw, tell us something about yourself.
I'm the banker of the group. So I've been in the banking industry for the last sort of 26 years. So I spent many years at organizations like Barclays and MasterCard and HSBC. And throughout my career, there were kind of two things I ended up focusing on. So I always ended up being the guy that was kind of building new businesses and building new divisions. And it was also always in kind of innovative space around digital payments and new market entries and things like that. So yeah, my kind of large chunk of the career was in financial services, but it was always about building and developing new businesses in the more innovative end of the industry. And I guess that gave me a real hungering to kind of go and do it properly rather than do it with a big company's money and all of the security that comes with that. So a number of years ago, I kind of then left the really big banks and helped build an open banking startup company called Token. From there, like Chris, I spent a bit of time at the open banking implementation entity in the UK. Whilst Chris was developing the standards and the technology side of open banking, I was sort of leading the development of the ecosystem and adoption and uptake. And that's where, again, as Chris said, we started working together and developing the vision and the mission and everything we're working on now at Ozone API.
Before we kind of jump into the hard questions and such, what would be great for our listeners is to really just understand what is Ozone API and what is it that you guys do?
When we were working sort of on the design and delivery of open banking in the UK, I think between the three of us, we had a really clear view that this move towards open banking, open finance, open data could be massively transformational. I mean, genuinely, this is something that will be world changing. It's going to grow economies, help tackle things like financial inclusion. The challenge is it has to be done really well. And we saw banks were finding it really hard. I mean, they were taking a lot longer than they expected. It's taking far more people, more budget. We saw an opportunity to build a technology platform to deliver really strong foundations. So we do two things. We provide a technology platform that helps sort of banks and financial institutions around the world implement their open APIs and kind of adapt and thrive in this new world of open banking. Help them comply where there's regulation, but give them the tools to go way beyond that and turn it into a really strategic part of their business. We also work with central banks and regulators to help create the right conditions, so help accelerate the delivery of open finance. And again, through technology primarily. We've got very deep expertise and we've got really good technology in this space. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell, the what we do.
Okay, cool. So I kind of want to jump into a bit about your backgrounds and the lead up to Ozone API. And so, Huw, can you tell us a little bit more about your sort of experience leading sort of the ecosystem growth piece at OBIE? You know, how you sort of, drove adoption usage over there?
Yeah, sure. And this is something I've done a number of times in the past as well. So it's spent some time MasterCard helping to drive adoption of new payment methods. I guess the brief was making sure that the ecosystem grew, adoption grew, and open banking started to deliver on the potential. So there were a few things we were focused on, really. One was, I mean, for this to take hold, you have to have participation within the ecosystem. You've got to have the banks doing what they need to do. You've got to have the third parties and all of the fintechs coming to connect to them. So part of it was about supporting the ecosystem to make sure there were as many participants as possible kind of come into play. But then it's about, there were a few things we were looking at. So really sort of evangelizing the potential and working with different sectors around the economy to make sure they understood the potential and started getting involved. And through doing so, also find some of those hero use cases that really drive adoption. I mean, some of them just happen naturally. Things like accounting platforms using open banking as the way of getting company information into the accounting platform. That became the default way of doing it really quickly. But in areas like payments, you need hero use cases to sort of pique people's interests and drive adoption. We had things like TfL doing that with the adoption of contactless. In the open banking space, it's been a little bit different, but it was actually the government. We spent a lot of time with the government talking about the benefits that this could bring. And it's actually the tax authority that have been pretty much the biggest user of open banking payments. There's like £10 billion worth of tax payments taken through open banking now. And the other piece as well was working with the banks, working with them as they were thinking about the world beyond complying with regulations like PSD2 and looking at, for those hero use cases, what are the capabilities that the banks need to expose? For example, things like variable recurring payments and delivering ever richer functionality through APIs that would unlock more and more. So yeah, it was really about getting out there, working with the whole ecosystem to grow participation, kind of evangelize the benefits, get those hero use cases moving and continue to think about what comes next.
Just talking about the UK specifically, do you think we've reached the point now in the UK where open banking is trusted, and do you think it will actually grow? Because there's obviously a point where it sort of stagnated. It didn't have a huge amount of adoption. It was one of those things of whether or not it was going to be something that genuinely gets taken up by the general public. Do you think we've overcome that now and it's going to be the way forward?
I think it's not as binary as that. I mean, I think increasingly more and more people are trusting it. Huw mentioned, business accounting. Pretty much every business who runs an online accounting software, which is pretty much every business, is now using open banking. So it's kind of implicitly trusted there. I think, it's not so much whether people trust open banking. It's actually whether people get the value and the right customer experience out of the end services. So open banking is really the kind of plumbing behind the scenes, but it's about, do people trust financial service companies? And that's what is a big benefit of the kind of model of open banking we've got where there's a regulatory driver, because, implicitly the only people who can access financial data is the customer themselves using strong customer authentication or a regulated third party. And that's that kind of trust framework that you've got, I think, has gone a long way to helping customers trust the financial service companies and therefore open banking. But I think there's still a long way to go.
I agree. It's definitely not binary. So I think we've seen in certain use cases, it is absolutely the default way of doing things now. But it isn't something where there's going to be one single catalyst, because it's such a broad underlying capability. I mean, what's been implemented is a model for secure consent-based data sharing. More than data, it's about taking action and making payments and things like that. But that's a really foundational, fundamental capability, and it'll flow through and get established in slightly different timescales for slightly different use cases. We're 5 years in. It's still actually pretty early in the journey. So for some of those use cases, it's really established and it's the main way of doing things. But there'll be other things over time. It becomes more and more the foundations of how things are done. And like a lot of sort of infrastructure and plumbing, a lot of the time people won't know and won't need to know exactly what's happening under the hood. They'll just know there's a company that's providing me a service, and through doing this, it makes my life better and easier. And it's that foundation of secure consent-based access that's allowing that to happen. I think there's some really good use cases, but actually, I think most of the potential still to come.
I think HMRC is, paying your tax payments, great use case. I love it for making my payments easier from my phone and whatnot. But perhaps, I clearly don't have as much imagination as you, Huw. So, what other use cases am I missing? Or, if you say the best is yet to come, where do you think it's heading?
So fundamentally, this is a foundation for kind of secure consent-based digital economy. In the banking space, there's so many sort of payment scenarios where there's still either friction or concern around fraud, and having a model where you're absolutely certain who the parties are and you get rid of the need for any of this kind of input of information, whether it's an invisible embedded recurring payment or whether it's about making sure there's absolute certainty for a bigger payment. There's so many payment use cases that are yet to be tackled through this. But if you think about kind of beyond the narrow scope of banking products, if we look across open finance, if we look across open data more broadly, what we've done is we're laying the foundations for, as I say, a much more connected digital economy. So I don't know, say for sake of argument, you are looking at kind of health insurance and you've got the ability to very simply provide kind of temporary access to your health data to make, and the data from your smartwatch and all of these things to make sure you're getting absolutely the best possible offer. I mean, that's one example, but there are so many. We've got some simple ones at the minute around seeing all your bank accounts in one place and making payments work well and helping drive better lending decisions and credit decisions by using all of this data about your incomings and outgoings. But as I say, the foundations that have been put in place are so much bigger than that. I think there's a whole load of use cases that even those of us that have been thinking about this for the last 6-7 years will not have thought of. There's so much potential to come.
The thing that everyone is talking about at the moment is VRP, variable recurring payments. And that was after lots and lots of heated discussion and debate. The technical model for VRP was something that we designed in the OBIE about 4 or 5 years ago in a series of workshops with banks and fintechs. These things take time, but there were a lot of challenges and concerns about whether it was even compliant with PSD2 RTS regulations that were in place at the time, whether it was something that could be mandated or should be mandated under the CMA order and or under PSD2. Everyone had a different view about all of these things, but ultimately everyone could also see the value. And there's I think a relatively low-hanging fruit, which is we're seeing firms like NatWest sort of leading the charge on this, is starting to bring VRP into mainstream use cases to do things like replacing potentially direct debits or subscription type scenarios, because it gives the customer much more visibility, transparency, choice about the payment scenarios that are there for, is actually can protect the customer much more and provide a better customer experience. Not to mention better settlement times for merchants and things like that. There's a lot of benefits from a customer experience point of view and also from a security and customer trust point of view around things like PRP. But if it's not mandated, it needs to be introduced as a sort of what we have termed or coined the phrase a premium API. So banks aren't mandated to support it, but they can do, and they can build a commercial model around it. And that's where we are now. So these are kind of immediate use cases that are starting to play out now, which can significantly extend the utility of what we've got. And then you've got the stuff that Huw is talking about, which is, I think, super exciting as well, which is, when you start looking at moving not just open banking, open finance, and then actually through to the wider open data paradigm, if you like, of, healthcare. I mean, that's super interesting. Probably the next major thing we're going to see fairly soon in the UK and potentially in Europe is open finance, extending these use cases around things like personal finance management, wealth management, those use cases where APIs can provide access not just to bank accounts, but all your financial products, lending, savings, investments, pensions, etc. And I think that's coming probably not, it won't be too far away before it starts to come into the UK. And I think that'll be a very positive thing and offer, again, significantly increased value for customers.
Yeah, I suppose it will massively increase personalisation and therefore creates another level of competitiveness, I suppose, in pricing for things like insurance and loans and all sorts of other bits and pieces.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what we're seeing as well, I think increasingly some of the banks are starting to realise this is a fundamental transformation of the banking business model. We were at an event last week, I think, and one of the senior execs from NatWest sat there and said, kind of getting this right is the future of the bank. So, I mean, historically, banks they've built products and they've only distributed them, primarily through their own channels. But all of a sudden, this is a way of creating capabilities and distributing them through great APIs so they can be embedded in the right place where the customer is at the right time with the right context. As you say, all that personalization, Shameer, all the additional data. All of a sudden, I mean, it massively brings down the costs to serve, but it makes the product delivery so much better if it's right place, right time, right context. So I think we're only at the very beginning of the banks and the financial services providers really starting to kind of grasp the business model implications of this.
I think this is probably a topic that I could probably discuss all day, really. I think it's fascinating, personally speaking. I think, as I said, I just clearly don't have the imagination required to think of all of the scenarios of what you can do with open banking and open finance. But I kind of want to switch streams a little bit and talk a little bit about Ozone and the business itself. You mentioned just before we kind of sort of started this call, started recording, that you've got customers globally. First and foremost, your solution that you're offering is not just UK focused. This is a global solution, and you're working with what parties across the world? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this kind of open banking, open finance thing it's absolutely a glable phenomenon now. And fundamentally, whilst there are differences in different jurisdictions, slightly different regulations, slightly different approaches, fundamentally, the core premise is the same. So we're working with banks and financial institutions and regulators around the world. Our biggest areas of focus, we've got a whole lot going on in the UK and Europe. This is a really, really hot area in Latin America. Brazil went first a couple of years ago, but now many of the markets in the region are all sort of following and implementing their own flavors of open banking and open finance. Middle East is, again, it's excuse the pun, it's kind of super hot. There's a lot going on in the Middle East right now. North America starting to move. Canada's moving towards it. The US is starting to talk about a more coordinated, regulated approach. So, our business is inherently global and getting ever more so, which, as we were talking, it creates a bit of a challenge in terms of the time zones and the hours, but makes for a really exciting challenge.
Have you taken a coordinated approach to kind of which territories you're going after, or are you kind of sort of smelling what sells and sort of leaning into it?
It's a mix of things, but ultimately the areas we focused on tend to be where the regulators are driving the agenda, or there are one or more large central institutions driving the agenda to try and get open banking up and running for an open finance up and running for a significant volume of ultimately end customers. What we've seen in for example in North America is it hasn't really happened yet. There's been open banking. I mean, open banking's been around in North America for at least 15 years, but the model has been predominantly screen scraping and credential sharing, customers giving their credentials, username, password to a third party who then accesses the bank on you and impersonates the customer and scrapes the data or accesses the account for making a payment potentially. That model's been around for a while, but it's done differently. There's no standard, there's no regulatory framework to ultimately, I suppose, protect citizens. So it means either there's inherent risk there or it means that things happen quite slowly. And the markets, I think, where we've focused on is where there's a more coordinated approach that's typically driven by a regulator, where there's a desire to have a single standard, and there's a imperative for financial institutions to move maybe a bit more quickly and all at the same time. So that's really what's driven our approach.
Do you have like direct relationships with the individual regulators? And I suppose a sort of part two of that question is has that been instrumental in your growth?
It varies. I mean, we sometimes have a very direct relationship with regulators, and sometimes it's in partnership with one or more other local firms in the region. Typically, it's the latter. It's a very key part of our business, being able to help regulators shape things in the right way, because what we've seen in a number of parts of the world, I'm not going to be mentioning specific jurisdictions, but we've seen a number of other markets copy what has been done in the UK. In fact, the majority of markets have actually copied the UK model, and sometimes they've copied the good bits and sometimes they've copied the bad bits. But it's obviously in our interest, but it's also in the interest of the market and everyone in the market, the banks, the third parties, the end customers, to learn from what's good in the UK and pick the good bits and not reinvent the wheel, because you can then do things much more quickly and for much lower cost. And because we were instrumental in, with our roles within the OBIE and helping set this up and get this up and running in the UK, I think we're in a very privileged position and a unique position to be able to actually work with regulators, like I said, either directly or in partnership with consultancies who already kind of have established relationships with those regulators, to help advise them and help effectively speed things up so that it doesn't take tens of millions of pounds and 5 years to get to the same place as the UK.
I suppose your background with the OBIE, there's relationships with the regulators and those partnerships. Do you think that's kind of been the catalyst or the backbone of your overall growth, or has there been sort of other ingredients into that perhaps we haven't discussed today?
I'd kind of put it down to a couple of things. We're fortunate. We've got a team that has depth of expertise that I think's unrivaled out there. So, I mean, as Chris mentioned, Chris and Freddie sort of led the development of the standards, but right across the team, we've got people who've been there and been helping deliver this in many markets around the world. So I think we've got a depth of expertise that's really powerful. And I mean, fundamentally, we're a technology business. We've built a technology platform that works really well. We take away the complexity of doing this for the banks and financial institutions, and sometimes for regulators. So what we're trying to do is just be smart about where is it happening and how do we kind of get ourselves into the market and distribute what we do and kind of build our presence and brand and influence in the right way. But I'd say for us, I think kind of the foundations we're building on really kind of strong depth of expertise, a great technology platform. And I mean, I think we've got a really clear view of where we're trying to get to. So we're trying to do one thing exceptionally well. We've got a very, very clear business model, vision of where we're going. So that also allows us to be kind of exceptionally focused in what we're doing.
So Huw, you mentioned you've got a really clear directive of what you want to deliver and kind of where you want to head to. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, kind of go back to the beginning of the conversation. We were talking about we have a very clear view and belief that this shift will be world changing, and that sounds kind of hugely grand, but we genuinely believe we're putting in the foundations to drive economic growth, help society, tackle things like financial inclusion and things, but it has to be based on strong technology. So our very, very kind of singular focus is we want to bring an excellent technology platform to help all of the businesses that need to adapt and thrive in this new world. So that starts with banks, to help banks around the world deliver great APIs. It extends into other finance companies. And then beyond that, it'll go across the sort of open data sphere. But it means delivering great technology that takes away the complexity and gives them the tools so that it really powers their business model. There's lots of things we're not trying to be. We're just trying to focus on that one technology challenge and bringing the expertise we've got and the platform we've built to do that. And yeah, so far it's going pretty well.
To a certain extent, it's disruptive, but also at the same time, it's potentially a very large part of a bank's ecosystem. And so with that, they've got to be somewhat selective of the partners that they're working with. How does Ozone sort of develop that credence with institutions and your customers, I suppose, to get those partnerships off the ground?
I mean, I think we have enormous credibility in this space now. Technology, the way it works is it's all our own code. It's agnostic of particular infrastructure. It can either be provided as software, or in almost all cases, we run it as a service on behalf of banks and FIs. But we do this for banks and for central banks as well. So yes, we are still a relatively small company, but we've got credibility because we're out there doing this in multiple parts of the world. We've got, I think, 7 hubs now in different jurisdictions. Because of various data protection, cybersecurity laws in different parts of the world, we typically have a local hub in each major market that we're supporting, or in each region, certainly. And we've got these different hubs all over the world based on different versions, localized versions of the standard. We're out there doing it, and typically we are quicker because we're right at the forefront of leading the agenda on helping create standards in many markets. We're able to also be very quick to respond to standards in different markets as and when they're published, to be early in the market, to provide sandboxes, proof of concepts, either for a whole market or for individual banks. And we're out there actively doing this for lots and lots of customers all over the world. So yeah, we have that credibility. We're, I would suggest, a much safer option than what we've seen most of the banks in the UK trying to do, and other parts of the world when they started doing this a few years ago, which is spending tens of millions, if not more, pounds, huge teams building their own technology from scratch. And they're all trying to build, the whole point about standards, they're all trying to build exactly the same thing, and they're all reinventing the wheel. What we can bring is not just the credibility of having done it, but significant cost savings, significant increase in the time to market, whether or not that's for a bank who's just looking for a compliance solution, or increasingly banks looking for something that can be an API channel to drive commercial benefit, to look at driving it as a commercial channel. Speed to market and costs are important in both of those use cases.
I'd put it down to 3 things. So on the trust side, I think we got to get 3 things. But we bring a depth of expertise that helps establish kind of trust and credibility, because we've got an expertise in this space that I think is pretty unrivaled. But then you've got to have a technology platform that's proven and works, and we've done that now. We've deployed it in many markets, many jurisdictions, and it works really well. But we exist to take away some of the complexity, but also ensure that we're helping our customers deliver APIs that are conformant and compliant with all of the right standards for wherever they operate. So we got to stay ahead of that game. So we work really hard to do that and make sure we're absolutely supporting all of the standards that are emerging. Everything's kind of compliant. We've got good at this stuff now.
What's the plan for Ozone in the short term, the next few years, and the medium to long term? And I'd be keen, sort of as a part two of that question, to kind of understand, what's your outlook for the fintech industry, and then more granularly, open banking, open finance, API banking as well.
One of the things we try and do is make sure we're really trying to manage the fundamentals week by week, month by month, quarter by quarter. We've got a pretty clear view of kind of what's coming where around the world. So the short to medium term, we're absolutely focusing all our efforts on growing in all of the next regions where this is happening. So I mentioned earlier, there's still a lot to do in UK and Europe. Latin America is really moving at the moment, and we're very busy working with clients right across the region. Middle East, again, is a very, very vibrant region at the moment, and things are starting to move in North America. So there's some very, very clear focus areas there that are keeping us busy. But in parallel, it's continuing to build out the platform and add more and more functionality so that we're giving banks the tools to really make this a core part of their business model. But I said earlier, the longer term, this is global, this is happening everywhere, and it's way more than open banking. So open banking is sort of it's a very big thin end of the wedge, but it then opens up open finance, which we're already shifting towards in Brazil, and it's coming soon in the UK, touch wood. But then we're seeing initiatives moving into other industry sectors in a broader open data. So yeah, our objective is to kind of follow that trajectory and try and stay ahead of anyone else. And in doing so, one of the things we've really enjoyed doing, we've been pretty proud of, is bring a great group of people together and build a really good team that's kind of fired up for that journey and kind of working together in the right way. It's an area we focus a huge amount of time on. How do we make sure we absolutely get the right people and we build the right culture? Because this is a pretty full-on journey. So we need everyone to be sort of fired up for the challenge, and that's a big part of our focus too.
We are still a relatively small company. We're moving very quickly. We're ambitious. We're growing our customers and our revenue at a significant rate. It's about supporting more banks and FIs in markets where we're already, active. And it's about helping shape the agenda in new emerging markets from an open banking, open finance perspective. At the moment, it's all about open banking and open finance, but longer term, there's a much bigger sort of open data agenda, which gets just even more interesting and exciting and ultimately valuable for end customers. But to reiterate what Huw said, we are entirely focused on building not just the right software, but building the right culture and getting the right people. We are super proud of our team. We've got people now in UK, India, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Latin America. So we're quite a distributed people, and it's been a real interesting learning building that business up when much of that growth was during COVID. But we're growing the team and the capabilities in the team and investing an awful lot in that. We put an awful lot into mentoring young talent in different parts of the world, particularly in our team out in India. We have a very good mentorship program, bringing on board interns and then taking them up the ladder of career progression. And that's something that we are incredibly proud of and invested in. And it's fantastic to see the culture. And we work hard. Everyone works hard. It's many small businesses are like that. You have to sometimes work long hours, but that's getting the right culture, getting people invested in the business as well. I think that's super key, and I think there's more we can do, but we're very proud of the way we're operating at the moment.
Gentlemen, it's been great having you on today. Thank you very much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat today.
Thanks, Shameer. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic.
The FML podcast is brought to you by Growth Gorilla. To find out how our marketing growth experts can boost your fintech's growth, head to growthgorilla.co.uk. And make sure to search for the FML podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Don't forget to click follow to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Growth Gorilla, thanks for listening.